Hello, welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks, and my colleague, Sadhbh Lynch. This week, we take a look at the latest in the WASPI campaign. We look across the North Sea to Sweden to see what's been going on with their investments, and then we look at state pension age reform ideas.
Okay, Dave, do you want to bring us through some of the developments that you've seen with WASPI?
Yeah, the WASPI campaign, so the Women Against State Pension Inequality, has been a relatively quiet news story of late. There's been a few investigations, announcements from the government, parliamentary ombudsman, which I might come back to in a second, which has meant that there's been little prospect of a positive outcome for the campaigners. Actually, what the campaigners want is actually quite hard to understand. Whether they want complete restitution, so state pension back to age 60 for all these people, or something else, we don't really know, or even something targeted at those that are in financial difficulties, which probably many of us would support, rather than retirement age of 60 for many women, some of which will be in very good defined benefit pension schemes. But anyway, what has happened is the Labour government have said they are looking again at their previous decision not to award any compensation to these women, because some evidence that previously was not included in that consideration has come to light, and so the Secretary of State will need to think about it again. I suppose the question is, does anyone think that will change the outcome? I don't think so. I think the outcome from the previous decision will be upheld. The only chink that the what we would have is the parliamentary ombudsman did have a ruling a few years ago, or a determination a few years ago, that the DWP hadn't communicated as effectively as it could have. Although I think the counter view being that this was announced in the budget in 1993, legislated for in 1995, had lots of news coverage in the intervening years, and lots of member websites from the government, and member communications from various pension schemes that people would member of would have advice of this change, because it was quite a big change going from 60 to 65. So interesting that there's a development, but I don't think there's going to be any good news for the WASPI women in this case. And I think the opinion of the nation seems to have shifted towards that being the right outcome. There was a lot of sympathy a few years ago for these cases, but I think the case hasn't been made very strongly that millions of women weren't aware, and that millions of women have lost out massively from this, because some will have, I'm sure, and there's some there could have been, and there probably should have been, some campaigning for women who were in poverty going into their retirement, when they previously thought they would get their pension at 60 and it was delayed. But the campaign to reward 3.6 million women was always going to be too high a bar for anyone really to get behind. I think the cost would be absolutely astronomical, and I think a Labour government desperately scrabbling around to find money to fill a 20 billion, slightly less perhaps, black hole would want to add a few billion to that via this campaign, which would fall on taxpayers to pay for. And we're all, like I say, we're all worrying about what our money is being spent on and hoping we don't have to pay more tax, and adding this to it would be a very unwelcome addition. So there you go, that's WASPI.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take a look across the North Sea towards Sweden. We don't often go overseas, but there's been some rumblings over there in Sweden around some investments that have not performed perhaps as well as they would like. While that's bad news for the Swedes, it probably has some knock-on impacts to what we might do in the UK. So what's been going on?
Yeah, so the Swedish pension fund invests heavily in a specific few projects. So some of them that have been mentioned and have performed particularly badly are Northvolt, so they do electric vehicle batteries, and then also Stegra, they do a version of green steel. So both of those are either filing for bankruptcy or they have funding gaps. So both companies basically are in quite bad situations. And the Swedish state pension fund has a large exposure to both of these companies. So obviously then the risk from those companies goes to the pensioner. So I guess the concern is here that the Swedish government are investing in these forward-looking green projects in order to add some development, I guess, to their political agenda. If they wanted Sweden to go into a more greener route, then they would obviously invest more within these companies. But that leads to a concentration of risk, which then ultimately falls on the pensioner rather than it being funded by the government. So I think something that I worry about here that is in relation to the UK is I know we've spoken a lot about investment in private assets. So Rachel Reeves announced, we were speaking about it, I guess, a few times now in Pensions in 10, but channeling UK pension funds into UK private assets, so infrastructure, AI, and doing a commitment of 5% of all pension schemes. So not mandatory at the moment, but if that was to become mandatory, it's something that I would be concerned about, because I think it shows, although they might look good at the moment, certain assets, if you're kind of using investments that you want to further the country, so like for furthering the UK, rather than considering what the pension scheme actually wants to invest in, you're changing investment strategies and you're kind of concentrating risk within a very specific area just because that's what the government wants to do, rather than it being what's best for the pensioners. So I think that's something that's concerning, that we obviously are seeing happening in Sweden, and how that's going to impact what could happen in the UK in the future as well.
Yeah, no, it is worrying. I think that concentration risk is really important. I think the allocations to these couple of employers was quite high compared to what the UK is probably offering or suggesting. So I suppose that we need to sort of take it with a slight pinch of salt in that sense. The government aren't asking for half of whatever the default fund to be put in these things, but it definitely is a headline that doesn't help the case. There's a lot of concern that the upsides could be great, and the modelling is obviously emphasizes the upside, but the downside when these projects don't work out or these industries don't pull through over the longer term, which is where pension schemes are investing, it is a worry. And so it's a bit of a it is yeah, it's definitely a tick in the cons box that this stuff happens. And we had something earlier on the year as well. I can't remember. I think the Canadian pension fund was impacted by something similar.
Yeah.
Big projects fall over, and there can be big losses for the investors. And yeah, it's no
Yeah,
the case.
sorry, I think it's hard because if you were to do an investment strategy and you decided to invest in those specific funds already, then I don't see any issue with it. But if there's like an alternate factor coming in and saying this is kind of what you should be doing, it's going to change your investment strategy away from what you think is optimal to, okay, I want to fit this constraint and then use the rest of, it's still 95% if you're only committing 5%, but that you then have to adjust the assets you're investing in, that maybe that wouldn't have been your initial investment strategy. So that's kind of the main thing that worries me, even though it is only 5%. Would you have invested that 5% into UK private assets if not for this kind of push?
Yeah, yeah. It's a weird constraint, isn't it? If you're building a strategy, how do you you're sort of handcuffed to certain assets and certain asset classes on one hand, and then it does impact. When you're doing risk return considerations, that you've got this sort of outlier that's not really part of your standard consideration, and you would love to get rid of it, but no, you've got to have it. And yeah, it probably will lead to. There's probably one thing that hasn't really been thought about very much. It probably will lead to some quite odd decision making on the other side as you try to counteract that and create something that is providing a balanced return for the saver.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, Dave, so you've been looking at some state pension reform ideas. Can you give us a bit of insight into that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. So Sir Steve Webb, I should salute Sir Steve. Do we salute Sir Steve? I don't know. Anyway, so Steve Webb and Stuart MacDonald. I'll salute him because I think he's someone who deserves a salute. Two guys at LCP. Stuart MacDonald, well known for his work with the CMI and mortality and longevity expert, and Sir Steve Webb, obviously pensions expert. And they've been thinking about state pension and what we should do about that. Obviously, there's an arm of government or commission in government thinking about state pension age and what that means. And they came up with the idea. Basically, I think they keyed off the thought that, okay, so we've got a problem that state pension's too expensive. We've got the demographic issues of an aging nation, and so what that means for long-term affordability of state pension, because we're going to have a weighting of older people and a smaller pool of younger people to pay for it, which is a massive. I honestly don't think that that sentence is said enough in society. That is the issue. If we think things are expensive now, they're going to get a whole lot more expensive, and there's going to be a whole lot fewer people paying for it. So that's a massive challenge, and we have to address it. We have to address it like grown-ups, really. And one issue they were talking about is, okay, let's try and look at how long people should be receiving their state pension for. And so the government, in their last review of the state pension age, said people should have a third of their adult life in retirement. But I think, and so Steve and Stuart make this point in their paper, is that we've come into sort of a period over the last 20, 30 years where state pension age, or has been relatively early in people's lives. We've been paying out state pensions for 25, 30 years, and whether that's right, historically, state pension age would have been a lot closer to people's death. So we've been paying the government will be paying out state pension for a lot shorter period of time. So there is that school of thought now coming through that state pension age is probably the only really significant tool the government has when they think about the cost of state pension. So it's going to have to go up. Okay, fine. If you increase it, you then have the downside of people not getting it. And that's going to make people very upset because they're going to be paying in for 40, 50 years of their national insurance contributions towards it. And then when they get there, they die and they don't get it. That doesn't feel fair. And so one thing that, and also that, sorry, just before I go on to the next idea was, and the concern around that is there are big differences across the country in different areas of people's longevity. And so, some areas people die sooner and they'll feel like, some industries and certain occupations, people, how do you keep working in these occupations until you drop effectively? That's not great. So one thing they thought, the idea they had was to give a sort of a 5-year guarantee to the state pension. So no matter what happens, the government will pay out the first 5 years of your state pension. And I think a lot of people thought that was a terrible idea because it would add loads and loads of cost to the state pension already. And, that's just ridiculous. But the majority of people don't die very early. Most people do live, on average, people live until mid-80s. So most people will receive their 5-year guarantee anyway. They won't receive it as a lump sum, and some will. And if you talk to actuaries, Si's an actuary, so you could talk to her, and she would explain that the actual cost, in DB schemes, they have 5-year guarantees. The funding strain of a 5-year guarantee is not huge because most people do live to receive it. So it feels like an actuary, Stuart, has had a good old think about this and thought, well, actually, 5-year guarantees aren't that expensive, and that will be a little bit of a softening of the blow for a rise in state pension age. And I thought it was a pretty clever idea, to be honest. So I think some people might just need to just have a little think about it and get their heads around it and think, okay, we're adding to the side, paying state pensions to people's heirs. That's crazy. Okay, it might feel crazy, but is it going to add that much more cost to the state pension? Probably not. Could it mean we could increase state pension age and save us all a few £1 billion? Maybe. It's still a very difficult conversation. I think it's one that I don't know what the right answer is, but I think this is actually a pretty decent idea.
Yeah, I think it's hard. Obviously, the more you increase state pension age, the more kind of those inequalities come through in some ways. Because if you're really working in an industry, I think manual labour was one of the ones that was mentioned in the paper, but if you're working in an industry where the life expectancy is much lower than average, and all of this is being done to calculate from the average age, it feels specifically unfair for people working in those industries. They're contributing the same amount as anyone else, but they don't have kind of any respite when things increase towards what their average age is in comparison to the rest of the country. So I think it's a good idea. Obviously, there's a lot of ideas that you could do, but yeah, I think it's a good idea.
I do agree, and I do think that needs to be resolved. And I think that's when we kind of need to look at working age, disability benefits, and make them work a bit better for people who can't work or need to reduce their working hours because they're getting old. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm sitting here as a middle-aged man in a suit and a tie, who sits on a chair all day. And I don't, these hands are soft. I don't do anything hard, anything particularly difficult. I get a bit fatter sitting down for too long, so maybe there's a risk factor there. But yeah, I'm not busting my body, carrying bricks up a ladder or whatever, to be, just to be pejorative, just to be kind of. I'm not doing that. My body isn't broken by that, and I could conceivably keep sitting in this chair for the next 20 years. Another 20 years of pensions in 10. God. But yeah, so I am very conscious of that, and it's very easy for me to say. But yeah, I think your points were made that the challenge to get that right is really hard.
Thanks everyone for listening. Make sure you tune in next week again for another Pensions in 10.